It's 3:30.
Oh,
my computer.
it's time to start. Yes, welcome to linkengineering.org's video conversation series. My name is Shelley Latham. I'm the community manager for Link Engineering, which is an engineering educator exchange sponsored by the National Academy of Engineering and with sponsorship from Chevron. And we're very excited today to have Beth Nan Meeteren with us. She's the director of Iowa Region Center for Early Development Education. And she's going to talk to us today about building literacy with PK through second grade engineering experiences. Beth is going to start us out by telling us a little bit about how she got into this combination of literacy and engineering and what her background is in this. So Beth, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I am the director of a center that represents all 3 state universities in Iowa. So the 3 little pinwheels stand for all the different colors of each athletic team that they have. University of Northern Iowa is where I am housed, but then the University of Iowa is just an hour down the road. And then Iowa State, close by Ames. I represent all 3, but again, at the University of Northern Iowa. I put a picture of me as I was just getting ready for my first day of school here, because I want to share a few things about why that's important in part of this discussion. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and I had a very rich experience learning about the world and how it worked on this farm. I grew flowers and vegetables with my mom and learned botany and entomology, and I did so on a larger scale in helping my father in the field. I gained an understanding of life science and anatomies. We raised cattle and hogs and chickens, and we milked 26 cows. And then I also got to engage in reverse engineering when I was stranded out in the field with broken equipment in the days before cell phones. And I had to either fix it or wait hours until someone figured out that I wasn't coming home. So I've been in formal school since I was 5 years old in one capacity or another. But I think my expertise in engineering was not served well in my formal schooling. And that's something that I hope we are rectifying in our schools today. A little bit of where I've been in school since I never left since I was 5. I have a bachelor's degree in social science, and that gave me a window into what the thought processes were in teaching and learning. I hold a master's degree in literacy, which gave me some insights on how children make sense of the written word. I taught first grade for over 20 years in a rural school and also in an urban school. And I earned a doctorate in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis on early STEM or early engineering. And I found myself reconnecting with my experiences as a child as I started to do research on what engineering is in early childhood. So the goal for this webinar, I'd like to examine the components of literacy development alongside the components of engineering development, and then hopefully we can consider the synergy of integration between the two. So when I attend workshops on engineering for younger students, almost every single workshop connects engineering with reading. And this kind of makes sense as reading dominates instructional time in early elementary right now. The engineering lessons typically start by reading a book about engineering to get young learners interested in engineering. And some of these books are fictional, a few are informational, but most engineering approaches connect reading to engineering by including a picture book. And that's okay. That is a way to connect to engineering, but it's only one component of literacy. And we're going to focus on the other components of literacy, starting with the foundational skills that are part of the component of reading. Those include phonological awareness, print concepts, phonics, word recognition, and fluency. And if you are a kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade teacher, you know these things very well because our nation has been heavily focused in our public schools on these foundational skills in literacy, to a fault, I might add. That's another conversation here. But so to those of you who might be in informal learning that don't know about literacy instruction, phonological awareness deals with the ability to recognize sounds in our spoken language, and then the print concepts deal with how print works. And what that means is that if you were looking at a page of print on the right side, in our language, we're going to start to read it in the upper left, we're going to read to the right, and then we're going to return to the next line, read again to the right, and they call those return sweeps. And if you are a reader of English, this is how our world of print works. But not all languages are designed in this way. Other foundational skills include phonics, or the pattern in which we arrange letters to represent chunks of sounds to create words, word recognition, or the ability to read a word without a great focus on the letters and sounds, and fluency, or the ability to read and comprehend print well enough in order to read it with expression and make it sound very much like speech. All of this is done to develop as readers, but literacy development must also include listening, speaking, and writing. And these are very important components that go side by side with engineering development. Engineering is a wonderful context for learning all of the components or tools of literacy, because literacy is a tool. It's actually technology when you think about it. It's a system that humans have created to serve the need to communicate, to learn about the world and how the social relationships work. It's how we stayed safe from the very beginning, and it's how we developed as cultures as we used literacy to communicate as we went on. We engineer our language to communicate, to write poems, write songs and novels, and we engineer our language to document and communicate what we are creating or learning. So it's very easy to see that literacy and science processes are very similar. Engineering experiences can be extremely helpful in developing skills in literacy. So for example, at the top, in literacy, one of the skills is to note the details in print. In science and engineering process skills, we want to observe and retain some small details of what we're observing. In literacy, we compare and contrast characters, types of genres, what's going on between one version of a story with another. And in science and engineering, we compare and contrast things in the world and to make sense of how they are working. In literacy, there's a sequence of events that follows a set of rules in order to make a poem or a story or a script for a play. And in science and engineering, we have a project of logic and analysis in order to tell our story about what we're figuring out. There's cause and effect in both. In literacy, it's important for us to distinguish fact from opinion. And in science and engineering, the focus is on the use of evidence to support claims, which ends up being facts. In literacy, we make inferences based on comprehension of what's going on in the story. And in science and engineering, we make inferences based on what we're observing and evidence that we're seeing in what we're trying out. Both domains, we draw conclusions. And in literacy, we link words with precise meanings through experiences, but then this is done with a greater detail, with a more narrow focus in science and engineering vocabulary. So you're going to see words in science and engineering that might be quite different than words that you will see in children's storybooks that are not linked to engineering or science. And most kids really cut their teeth on narrative books. And so they aren't really used to a lot of those kinds of science and engineering vocabulary. But we have found that engineering is very powerful as a tool for learning literacy because it illuminates how the world works. And by engaging in experiences, we start to develop those conceptual understandings as we're examining this. And through this, we grow in our capacity to reason. We grow in what we use to know about how the world works, and it challenges us to re-examine what we thought we knew and take a closer look at things and then gain a deeper, a more accurate understanding of concepts. Engineering experiences are all about forming the mind or to exercise your brain or thinking, which results in increasing your intelligence. But it goes so much farther than memorizing facts. And Florence Kohlberg and Rita DeVries wrote about this as education is about forming the mind, not just furnishing it. So it's going beyond just memorizing facts or memorizing things to spit back, but it really changes the way your whole brain processes things. It's forming that mind to engage in logic and reasoning. Engineering is often thought of as part of the acronym of STEM. I almost never see it outside of the context of STEM. And actually, if you have engineering, you have all the letters in STEM, whereas you can do science without engaging in engineering. You can do math without engaging in science or engineering or technology. But if you're doing engineering, you're engaging with science, technology, and mathematics. And I think that's why it's such a rich tool to use in the school setting. Science, in education, we focus primarily on 3 domains in science. That's life science, earth and space science, and physical science. But this has really changed in education since I started going to school. Whereas before, science was talked about as something that you had to memorize. And then there was this scientific method that was taught to us, that we had to learn the steps of the scientific method. And then we were given experiences or experiments that would follow the steps of the scientific method. And if we got the answer that was in the answer key that the teacher had, we knew we had performed the experiment correctly. Well, that really isn't an experiment. It's following directions is what it is. And what the National Research Council is trying to do, and science education has been trying to do, is rid itself of the whole idea of the scientific method. They said that's really not how scientists work. That the science is much more messy. It's they might write up their research reports like a scientific method, but to do science in education is more powerful. And so the old way of science education was more about furnishing the mind of facts to memorize, and science education is now focusing on helping kids to do science. And in the process of doing science or engaging in science inquiry, they're developing scientific habits of mind. And the way you can think about how well you're doing with this, if you can look at your children in your classroom, and if you can imagine that they're saying, oh, I want to observe that more closely. Oh, that makes me wonder about, so that they're having their own questions, and that they are driven to gather information to find answers to their questions. And then maybe they find out that they were focused on a very low-level question, that maybe they should have been asking a question in this way. So you let them change their mind, their direction of their learning, so that they can keep gathering information. And then in their exploration, they might even change their mind on what they're investigating. But that's the whole messy process of sciencing. And that's what science education is trying to help elementary educators to understand, that it is more helpful, it's healthier to approach science as inquiry than as something very rigid as following steps to the scientific method. So the next letter in the acronym is technology. And when people think of technology within STEM, their mind immediately wants to go to computers or cell phones or iPads. And my mind does that too. But I think that's a very narrow focus for what the word technology is. And the definition from the National Academy of Engineering is the process by which humans modify nature to meet their needs and wants. And the International Technology Education Association defines it as the innovation, change, or modification of the natural environment in order to satisfy perceived human wants and needs. And so you can think about technology aside from computer technology, and you can think of some very simple technology. For example, when somebody's feet started to get cold, they designed a shoe to serve the need of keeping their foot warm or protected if they were walking across rocks. If they were trying to keep their shoe on their foot, then they invented the technology of a shoelace that would tie the shoe onto the foot. And if you were frustrated by rethreading that shoelace and it was all frayed, there was somebody that invented the technology of an aglet, which is that little piece of plastic that goes at the end of a shoelace that helps you thread that shoe a little bit more easily. So technology does not have to necessarily mean computers or something that is driven by batteries or electricity, if we think more broadly about technology, our world becomes much more interesting to us. And so now let's just substitute the word human with children, the process by which children modify nature to meet their needs and wants. Then that helps us look at things a little bit more developmentally appropriate with young children. And when I started doing this, I started to realize I was misidentifying some behaviors as misbehavior when actually they were trying to make something that I was having them do that was very dull, trying to make it more interesting. And the example I like to give my students is, as a first grade teacher, you have that old saying, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb. And so there's this old, tired routine that first grade teachers will do is they haul out the cotton balls and they haul out the paper lamb out of construction paper. And then they integrate math by having them count the cotton balls, and they practice one-to-one correspondence by doing a dot of glue and a cotton ball and a dot of glue and a cotton ball. And I can remember one time this little boy was doing this, and he kind of had his hand and holding his head up. And then I noticed he took the lid off of his glue and he had poured it all over his construction paper, and he was lifting up the paper and kind of tearing it. And I gave him another piece of construction paper lamb and corrected his behavior. But in retrospect, he was really trying to make something a little bit more interesting. I wonder now if he was noticing how the glue saturates the paper and how it makes it tear more easily. And, oh, when I tear the paper apart, look at these little pieces that are they almost look like thread. So I think now I look back to things that I did with my children in first grade that may have been terribly boring things for them to do, and things that were furnishing their minds when I could have created experience that would help them form the mind instead. And that child was trying to teach me something, and I was not listening. I was not very much in tune with this. So here, let's think about what engineering is. Engineering is new to early education, and it's been a struggle to make it a good fit. And teachers know children, and lucky young children have teachers who also know child development. But these teachers rarely feel comfortable in teaching engineering. And so those that are ready to take it on, they seek lots of materials to help them teach engineering. They go to Pinterest or they go to curriculum programs that have it all laid out because they don't feel confident in being able to work with engineering with young kids. And it can be difficult to go through that engineering material because kids often have other ideas rolling around in their heads. And in Iowa, we have snow, so I'm going to use the illustration of a child playing with snow. And one of the things that brings them absolute joy is when the snow is just the right consistency and we've had a really healthy snowstorm. They like to make snow forts, and they go to where the banks are, and they like to chop these chunks of snow out and they carry them to another place and they start to build snow forts. And so here you have this example of this teacher that's excited about teaching engineering to the class, and she's working really hard to teach them about engineering and to practice what engineers do. And the child's coming into the classroom from recess. Oh, when's the next recess so I can get back to building snow forts? So in the early engineering curriculum materials, they often walk teachers through a process of breaking down an adult idea of engineering into simple parts for young children to try to lift them up to the adult understanding of engineering. And it often begins with the idea of telling children that engineers solve problems. And then because the STEM industry is really wanting to have more and more STEM employees, STEM-literate employees, they really want to plant the idea of becoming an engineer in young children's heads. And one of their biggest beefs is they'll ask children, what is an engineer? And if the child says, well, an engineer drives trains, it drives that person absolutely nuts. But they're not incorrect, because there are engineers who do drive trains. And so getting upset about that, I think, is kind of a lost effort here. Because there are a lot of people that hold doctorates, but that doesn't mean they wear white lab coats, and that doesn't mean that they're going to give you a vaccination or keep you healthy. There's lots of different doctorates too, but nobody gets bent out of shape over that. And so you have to take a broad look about what engineering is. And yes, it includes people that drive trains. And yes, you can be an engineer when you grow up. Oops, I did it again. And then they try to teach them what engineers do by walking them through an engineering design process. And there's usually a culminating activity that's done by following the steps of the engineering design process. And so now the teacher's saying, we just read a book about what engineers do, and now here is a problem for you to solve, because engineers solve people's problems. And so your job is to work in a group to design a solution, because engineers work in groups. And so you have to learn to work in a group. And so engineers, they draw up a plan because they want to save money before they create the product. So you draw your plan up before you create your solution, and then you test and improve your solution with your group. And by doing that, the idea is that you have brought this child up to this adult level, this adult understanding of what engineering is. And meanwhile, the kid is still thinking, I have to find a snowbank that is really packed really hard to get those blocks of snow. And what the teacher is actually doing is, now she's thinking, now you know what engineers are and what they do, and maybe you'll be an engineer someday. And the child's thinking about when she holds her hand like a karate chop, she could slice through those snow bricks. And if you look at what she's doing, she's really engaging in engineering behaviors already. And so the teacher's ready to go on to the next unit. The child is still engaging in the engineering activity of trying, how am I going to keep that wall from falling down all the time? What are we doing wrong? How are we stacking those snow chunks that keep the wall from falling down? And so I'd like to introduce the idea of not just early engineering, but developmental early engineering. And this is another perspective that needs an attentive teacher that listens to the children and knows them well. And so a teacher that listens to what kids are doing outside or what's happening at home or things that they're trying out, you can get an idea of when they are engaging in engineering behaviors. And building snow forts is engineering behavior. They're cutting out the blocks, and Dawn is carrying them over to the fort, and Whitney's stacking them, but one wall keeps falling over, and we're trying to make it stronger. So she's already working in a team, which is really kind of rare in early childhood, because most kids are pretty egocentric, and they resist working in a team. They're just sorting these personality things out. And so demanding that they work as a team to solve another person's problem really is a big leap for them. They're more interested in solving their own problems, and sometimes they need that privacy of trying things out on their own first. And then if other kids are interested, they might do some parallel work, and then they start sharing back and forth. So they kind of grow into that collaboration piece of it. And so instead of building the child up to the adult idea of engineering, the adult is looking at where engineering is already occurring in the child's life, and then how can you nurture and support those engineering ideas. So for example, the teacher is seeing that there is interest in building snow forts, and they are already designing and building, and they are already working as a team, and they even have a system in their building process. One child is cutting the bricks out, another one is carrying them over to where the fort is, and the other person is stacking them up. But they do have a problem, and that's a problem with the wall coming down. And they are highly invested in solving this problem because it's theirs. It's something that they really care about. And so if teachers think about what are the possibilities for learning in this interest, and how can I support their engineering behaviors? And I wonder how many other students are interested in this, and what kind of provocation could I make to get more interested in it? And is it possible to make a space and time for building structures, not of snow, but of other things in the classroom? So the first step, I think, in developmental early engineering is to sit back and recognize where kids are already they are engaging in engineering behaviors, and how can you support them? And a lot of times teachers will sit down and they'll make a web, or they'll make a list, or they'll do a storyline of how things could play out. And they think about all the possibilities. With snow, you can think about solids and liquids and freezing and thawing. With other kinds of building materials, you can think about the properties. Some are plastic, some are wood, some are hollow, some are solid. And then thinking about how this could start. Could you web around the world building? Or could you do a language experience activity about building a snow fort? What kinds of blocks could I bring into the classroom? So all of these things are swimming around until you come up with a plan to just get started. And then you and the child can co-construct how this engineering experience is going to be. And what we found is that instead of starting with a book, start with a child's story. And use that as an opportunity to engage in the shared writing or interactive writing, where the teacher and the child are both sharing the pen, or the child or the class is dictating the story and the teacher is writing it out on chart paper, and then they're reading it back. So here's this wonderful opportunity to marry engineering and literacy learning at the same time. And you don't have to bribe kids to stay invested in writing this down, because it's theirs. They own it. And so that interest is there. So I haven't talked about the engineering design process, you may have noticed. And when I first started doing some research on engineering, I read Engineering in K-12 Education. And they do mention that engineering education should involve design thinking, but they didn't specifically name the engineering design process. But they did talk a great deal about the most important part of engineering education is developing these engineering habits of mind. Very much like how we talked about the scientific habits of mind. And so one component of engineering habits of mind is systems thinking, creativity, optimism, collaboration, communication, and then there's attention to ethical considerations. And in the book, they have adult definitions of examples of how this works out in the engineering careers. But here I've tried to embed how children might be engaging in engineering habits of mind. So a child's engaging in systems thinking when you can see them thinking, oh, I notice when I change this part, I need to change the next part because this will impact that. So being able to hold multiple things inside their head, that demands a whole lot of cognitive flexibility and working memory to keep that all going. And it's a very powerful exercise in developing relationships, conceptual understandings, and intelligence. So systems thinking is very important. Creativity, if I rotate this piece, I can get it to fit there, or just it's embedded in the design itself to have an idea of how you're going to build or create something. Optimism, that's something that we hear a lot about. Kids are lacking this, and some people call this grit, and I kind of resist that. It's a little bit acerbic to me, but optimism, just, oh, if it didn't work this time, I'm going to try it another way and see if it's going to work this other way. That's a healthy way of dealing with it, where grit kind of implies, oh, I'm just going to stick this out and make my way through it because it's really painful, but I'm going to do it. But you don't really grow optimism in that way.
It's 4 o'clock.
Sorry, I'm halfway through. That's a good reminder for me. My time is going fast. Then collaboration, where this can work better if we all work together. And then communication, they want to tell everybody. And then attentions to ethical considerations. If I take all of these pieces, no one else is going to get any, so I shouldn't take so many. So this also works with literacy. I noticed that I change this part of the story, I'm going to change the other part. Or if I move this part of the story here, then I can get the audience excited to do this. Or when they're problem solving, when they're reading, oh, I didn't figure out the word that way, but if I try figuring out a word from another way, that's optimism as well. And then collaboration of reading together or taking turns reading or communication. Let's tell everybody, let's write about this or create this story or this documentation panel so that everybody understands what we're doing. And the attention to ethical considerations, the literacies, our words matter. how we speak to each other, how we talk to each other, how we relate to each other, it does matter. So engineering habits of mind isn't just for engineering, it's kind of 21st century thinking skills, which is pretty awesome. But everything that I learned about engineering in early childhood, I learned from kids. They really taught us what engineering is. So I'm going to share with you some scenarios that kids were doing, and I want you to think about where the engineering habits of mind are in this short little video here. So what they've done is they found this little snail outside at recess time, and we had critter cages at the ready, and so they could bring the snail in. And part of the deal is when they find a creature outside, they have to be cognizant of the habitat where they found it so that they can recreate that habitat in the classroom so the creature's going to be safe and comfortable while we study it, but just for a short piece of time. And so what they're doing is they're putting together little booklets so that they can start to jot down their notes about what they're observing about this snail. And I did not tell them to do any of this. This was all their idea. So you can see systems thinking and how they're putting together the book, the creativity, and that they're thinking of how to document their thinking in a booklet form. The optimism, I didn't see any frustration there yet. The collaboration, how they kind of have this assembly line thing going. The communication, where they all agreed of how they were going to document what they're figuring out. The attention to ethical considerations is how they're going to care for this snail as they are observing. So let's move on to another little scenario. And these two little boys are working on getting a marble to go down a ramp. And they did not, how do I say, these two little boys were not best friends. They were not even good friends, but they really respected what the other one knew about how to get a marble system to work. And so they were able to stuff down their dislike for each other because they wanted to work with each other because they could create this really cool stuff. So they were paying attention to ethical considerations because they knew they had to temper their emotions in order to work together. They were communicating with each other and collaborating. There was optimism in that it didn't work the first time, it didn't work the second time or third time. The creativity was it was their design, their challenge. They wanted to make this system work in this way. They wanted a downward slope to get it started, a slight incline, turn a 90-degree angle, go down, turn another 90-degree angle, and then go down. And you can see how they're using their understanding of force and motion by blocking the path of the marble to force it to make the curve. So here's an example of engineering habits of mind in the world of children. This works really well because they're very highly interested in this. And Piaget said years ago that this is really the fuel that ignites the process of figuring out a solution or the construction of knowledge. And he talked about this as error-informed experimentation, where kids try out their ideas, they test them, they observe the results, and then they refine their ideas and test it again. So what he was talking about all those years ago was developmental early engineering. It's always been with us. It was just like me not seeing where it was in my children's lives, and I was missing out. Another person that recognized this is Henry Petrosky, and he's a renowned civil engineer who is a good systems analyst person. He builds a lot of bridges in the country, but he also writes a lot of books about simple technology. I think he wrote a book about the pencil, the paperclip, the scissors, the toothpick, but he saw engineering in early childhood, excuse me, as when they're stacking cans, or when they're moving dirt and sand, when they're designing their own toys or revamping a game with different rules. That's engineering in the world of a child, and it's rooted very deeply in imagination, choice, and play. And when you look at companies like Google and Ideal, they are very playful because they find that so essential in innovation. They go back to their roots in childhood. They connect with their inner child and they engage in this kind of engineering thinking again. A formal, simple definition by William Wolfe, who was, I think, past president of National Academy of Engineering, he said, very simply, engineering is design under constraint. And some typical engineering constraints for adults are the laws of physics, materials and their properties, space, time, and budget. And for children, it's really not that different. They have to grapple with the laws of physics, the materials and their properties, the space that they're allowed, the time that they have, the availability of the materials, but their biggest constraint is opportunity. And that's something that we are having a hard time finding for our children in our schools. There's not much opportunity for this. Now, a lot of people think that kids can't handle engineering, but you may have heard some talk about executive function skills, inhibitory control, where they're resisting habits, temptations, or distractions, working memory, holding and using information in your head, moving it around, and with the cognitive flexibility, moving it around in your head. I talked a little bit about this. There's more and more research pointing to how this is so important to start developing at an early age, because they find children's executive function skills is a greater predictor of literacy success than phonemic awareness assessments. In fact, it's a greater predictor of a success in all academic domains. And what kinds of experiences help executive function skills? And those are experiences that require strategy and reflection, logic and reasoning, problem solving, that challenge to hold in mind their previous belief while they kind of mess around with what they think, how it needs to change, and then to think about categorization. So that's by definition, engineering experiences do that all. And so if you are engaging children in engineering experiences on a regular basis, you're helping them to develop those executive function skills. The National Academy of Engineering saw engineering design as this great pedagogical strategy. And I think it was before they were talking about executive functioning skills. But here you see a photograph of, these are children who wanted to retell the fish in the sea. And so they had some characters to stand, wooden characters to stand in, but they wanted a dock for them to fish off. And then they wanted the house for the characters to build on. And then they needed a lake for the fish to be in. And so they have constructed their own materials to retell the story. So that's one way of integrating literacy. But the best way of getting engineering in classrooms is by marrying it with physics. If you have physics and engineering, you have the interest of the children. And what's great about physics is that it's producible by kids. They don't have to wait for an adult to do it. You don't have to worry about protecting a creature or touching anything hot or anything like that. Then the result of what they do is immediate. They don't have to wait. And if you plant a seed and water it, you have to wait quite a while for that seed to grow. But with physics, that effect is immediate and it's observable. They can see it, they can hear it, sometimes they can feel a weight change. And then the kicker is when it's variable. And that's what keeps them coming back, and that's the engineering piece. And what you see is a first grade classroom that is equipped with a set of unit blocks and children giving access to build marble runs using the unit blocks and track to make those marbles move in different ways. So again, if you're worried about how kids are going to respond to these kinds of materials, sometimes you want to start with rule making and have the children be involved when writing the rules. How are we going to keep everyone safe? And if they have a part in creating the rules, they are very invested in holding each other accountable. And if they are helping in writing them down, they will drag somebody else over to the rules and say, see, we promised we were going to do this. Now, what we do try to do is help kids to rephrase things to keep things more positive. So instead of don't put ramps in the air, don't bang the ramps on the floor, and that you can help them think about things in a more positive frame of mind by saying ramps stay on the ground, put ramps down carefully. So that's kind of engineering language in a way as well too. With the interactive writing here, there's a lot of things that you can do to support literacy learning. This teacher wrote things in red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, and she wrote the names of the contributors of the ideas right behind. And some of the kids that are just on the very beginning understanding of how print works, they won't remember how to read it, but they'll know where theirs is. And they'll bring somebody over to help them read it, or they'll bring their parent after school and say, I helped write this rule, and they can read it together. And sometimes they start to make sense of print by reading what they have co-created together in writing. You have lots of opportunities to engage in high frequency words when you're writing them. When you come to the word on, I know some of you know how to write the word on. Who can write the word on here? So inviting children up to come in and write the word on, or the, or we, or up. And so again, they're very engaged in developing those rules. It's important to think about concepts that are developed through conversations that focus on reasoning rather than those right answers. And again, that's going back to forming the mind, not furnishing things, furnishing the mind. And then being okay with kids repeating the same action over and over and over again. That's their way of finding out the predictability. Is this always going to happen this way? Let me look at that again. Did I really see that correctly? That's that iterative behavior of engineering that isn't really solving a problem as much as helping them understanding how the properties of force and motion are working with the materials that the object that they're moving, that effect. And so I have two photos here by Peggy Ashbrook. She is a columnist for Science and Children for Early Science. And if you get Science and Children, look for her columns because she writes very well for early science learning. And she has been doing professional development with teachers on ramps and pathways. And she didn't have unit blocks in a lot of places. So they brought in sponges for the kids to use as supports. Then to contain them, she would bring in bread boxes so that the kids could keep the objects more contained. But what kids start to engineer is they figure out how to make a marble turn a corner. So they're grappling with Newton's laws of motion. You're not asking them to name Newton's laws of motion, but they're figuring out how the laws of physics work. So they get a working understanding of physics in order to make things happen. And then before long, they're turning multiple corners. And then they have an idea that they're going to change the direction of a marble. And so they'll have a marble go down from the left to the right, then drop down, and then move from the right to the left. All of their ideas, these kids were teaching us all the different ways they could move marbles. One child had seen a monster truck rally, and then so he had the idea that he's going to create a system that allowed the marble to jump over a gap over two cars. Other children had gone to an amusement park and had the idea of getting a marble to turn a loop. And so they were very demanding that they had the right kind of materials to allow them to figure that out. And so I had to find something flexible enough for them to curl and a way for them to attach it to the floor. So we used the foam pipe insulation and Velcro so that they could tighten that curl. Then when space got to be an issue, we gave them real estate to work within. So how far could they get their marble to travel in just this narrow piece of real estate? And we found kids would start to build vertically to try to get the most mileage out of a marble. This is an example of a second grader that got a marble to travel 39 feet in a 3x3 foot of space. And when they first start to figure out the physics behind it, it's not very pretty, but once they start to understand the physics, their structures become more and more beautiful. The aesthetics start to get involved. The vocabulary that you are able to use with children is very powerful. And it's vocabulary that you don't typically run into in early childhood text, but it's a vocabulary that have to do with properties, motion, position, condition, and actions. And so this was one experiment where I had my university students record all the different types of language that they were using when they were working with ramps and pathways. And we were astounded at the variety and the diversity of language that they were doing. But at the very beginning, when kids are starting to figure this out, a good idea is to take a digital photo, print it out on paper, and then invite them to write what they were doing. And then this is an example of a child that knew to start left to right, but he didn't know that he kept curving it around. So it starts on the left, I was racing, and then the ing kind of goes to the left again. So he's kind of writing in a snake. So it's really interesting that you get a window into their conceptual understanding of how print works by their interest in writing about what they're doing. When kids don't have an understanding of a word, sometimes we ask them to tell me what you're trying to say, and they would say it, we would repeat it back, and then we'd count how many words they said, and then we would make yellow lines underneath. Okay, so here's where you write each word. And that helps kids help to develop a sense of word. And before long, they start to document using conventional spellings, and start to pay attention to more mechanics too. Although we never assess them on their writing or in a formal sense, it more informed our teaching as a formative assessment, letting us know where they were in their conceptual understanding of print. Now, one of the things that engineering curriculum will ask you to do is to ask kids to draw before they build. And that's difficult to ask young kids because they don't have enough understanding about the laws of physics, and they don't have enough experience with properties of materials to know how that's all going to interact. So they might draw a plan just because they're obedient, but their plan rarely informs what they build. It rarely matches, but every once in a while it does. And so sometimes we invite kids to draw, but they're more apt to draw after they build it. But even that is difficult because it's hard to draw a three-dimensional thing with action on a two-dimensional plane. And so we try not to force that on kids. Here's a few more examples. Here's a little boy that was doing a top view in the orange on the right, side view on the green. And these were kids that were working with Peggy. Here's another examples that she had a child do. And so it's got a mixture of the adult writing down the child's words with the child's drawings to tell exactly what happened. And then this happened once. There was a child that drew a top view and a side view of her structure. And she emailed it to me. I said, whoa, tell me about this kid. She says, well, I have to tell you, her parents are artists. So they do a lot of drawing in the home. So the experience of drawing had a great impact on that. But blueprints, engineers do use blueprints. So how does that look at the very beginning? Because marble systems are three-dimensional. Here's an example that came very naturally with a little girl that was really interested in building ramps with hills and valleys. And she got really good at it to the point where she'd say, just give me a challenge and I will build it for you. So draw it out. And so we would start to do these linear blueprints for her, which started to help us think about left to right again. But then she would take the blueprint, use it, and then build the ramp system. And you see how incremental changes that they were making in the height in order for the marble to go over the track. But one time I decided I was going to make something that was impossible. And so I drew this as a blueprint, seeing what she would do. And you can see that the first hill, after it goes down, the first hill is much lower than the next one. So it's impossible to do. And those two little girls took it over to the blocks. They looked at it, and it wasn't like 10 seconds. They came back and they said, sorry, we can't build this for you. And I said, well, you told me you would build anything I wanted. I want this built. And it's, no, it's not possible because the marble's not going to have enough speed to get up this. So they were explaining the whole concept. So we brought it to the rest of the class to see if everybody else was thinking that way. So we had a chance to talk about first and second in our print. And the kids had a whole conversation about the problems that you have in getting just the right elevation to get just the right speed. It's just amazing what kids think. Why is this all relevant? Because in the Common Core, it does talk about technical text, directions, forms, information displayed in graphs, charts, maps. And this is a wonderful context for making charts, and graphs, where they have to write a title, where they're labeling things, where they're sorting things, where they're classifying. And in the process, they're using beginning sounds to write the initial letter, and then they're comparing. Here's a little boy that's writing about his exploration in water. They're engineering water. These are little plastic cups with holes in different places in the cups. And so they're working together to build a water system to move the water from one cup to another. And after a while, we give them a pegboard and rings so that they can start to put the cups into holes. And then they start to build these fountains for one cup to drain into another. And you might notice that at the bottom of the one in the middle, there's a little tornado type effect that happens with water. They noticed that. And in the background, you might see a chart on the wall. When the water's high, there's a tornado, but when the water's low, then there isn't the tornado. It's amazing the details that they notice. Here's where they had a reservoir where we used an upside down liter bottle in a tube, and they figured out that they needed the reservoir in a high place in order to get it to work to fill the cups. And then the kids made the leap, well, that's why water towers are up high, is so that the water can come through the pipes. It's just wonderful when you put them in these kinds of experiences. Engineering soap bubbles, which might seem really, really trivial, but kids are interested in it. And here is a story of a child that is writing about what she's noticing. And notice how she's circling the words. She's not sure that she spelled them correctly, but rather than holding herself back, she's writing down in a logical way so that she can come back and fix them later. So that's a very healthy attitude towards writing and then taking risks in literacy behavior. These are sippy cups where we saw the bottoms off, and then we put different kinds of fabric on the ends of it with different kinds of weaves, and the density of the fabric affects the kind of snake that emerges, and that was very fascinating to them. But conceptualizing what was going on inside of a bubble, noticing that when she holds the bubble and puts her hands together, the air has to go somewhere, so the air reaches out at the top and the bottom, and how she can manipulate the air inside the skin of a bubble. Again, the literacy, again, documenting what they're noticing, what's the best way to make a bubble. Here's one where they were using macrame cord and tubes to make a film, and then noticing that they could make a bubble just by using the air in the room and moving the utensil. And then writing about this, where the kids were taking the bubble and almost putting it on like a hat. And if you notice, you see that inside is underlined and the AW and SAW. The kids got so close, used to observing, that this spilled over into their literacy. So they started to notice patterns in how words are spelled and spelling patterns. It became part of their habits of mind. Okay. Now, to show how this is worthwhile, I ran across this story recently. There was this boy that was trying to get soap bubbles to spread on the surface, but they kept bursting. And then he noticed that once popped, the bubble doesn't disappear, but it creates a ring of miniature bubbles. And he asked why, and no one knew. And then he asked even more questions. Why do drops splash? And had no answer. Well, this person went on to do some research, and he is now, I think he's a graduate from Harvard, and now his research is in the field of healthcare, looking at virus transfer via droplets, energy, working on boiling and condensation, and the materials or foams. And he says when he teaches classes, he could teach a whole course about bubbles. The more I learn about them, the more I realize how much we don't know. And so we have to stop thinking about what kids are looking at as frivolous. It's very rich material that we need to pay attention to. Another person is Stanford bioengineer that got a Genius grant to investigate bubbles. And I was listening to a thing on NPR with him, and somebody had noticed that when you added dye to the bubbles, where they joined, he said it's a perfect 120 degrees. The bubbles like to be in pairs of 3. If they can't be by themselves, they're going to be round. But if they can't be round, they want to be with 3. And I never thought about that until I started looking at them. By golly, it is. And there's always a 120 degree intersection because there's 360 degrees in a circle. Fascinating, isn't it? And even climate change, they're starting to study bubbles in climate change that have a lot to do with what's released into the atmosphere, and they're even finding tonal differences in bubbles that pop in waves that tell them about the condition of the climate. So here's a second grade classroom that is just starting to document things about bubbles on a wall. All the writing goes on the wall, very much integrated with literacy. I'm going to score ahead here a second here. I'm going to just give you a few other examples because I have like 4 minutes. Engineering rotational motion with tops is another engineering experience where they can write lists of materials that they're going to need. There's Noah, who hated reading at the beginning, but then he started to write, I made a top, and it actually spins, and it is 5 inches and 1/4, and then started to write more about tops. Chemical engineering with making pancakes, engineering pancake recipes. The more water in the batter will make a bigger but flatter pancake. Engineering pudding, the more milk is added to a dry mix, it becomes thin and runny, and the length of time the pudding mixture is shaken affects the viscosity of the pudding. Even corn muffins, we would make corn muffins in the microwave, and they would adapt recipes until they would tweak it, and Aaliyah's was better than the one that we had come up with, and so everybody was using Aaliyah's recipe. This fits in with older children too. These are 5th graders that were doing an investigation on engineering a pancake recipe, which even involved investigating about when was the appropriate time to flip a pancake. Physics of sound. Are you making instruments as a craft when they could be an engineering challenge in looking at vibration with rubber bands and how the tension of the rubber band is going to change the sound? Where this can happen is during your regular science time, but I found that kids were so thirsty about it. We have schools that are doing this during small group reading instruction. Whereas what are the other 2/3 of the class doing while you're with small group reading? Most schools, they're reading to self, someone else, they're listening to reading, working on writing or word work. And so the kids are going back between guided reading and literacy. Well, we have added STEM investigations to this. And the kids stay engaged in their investigations, and there's a whole lot of vocabulary and talk and discussion at the end of the morning that leads right back into writing and literacy. So as you're just finishing up one small group instruction, this is going on nearby, and kids learn to work with the sounds in the room, with the acoustics, and everybody stays happy because there's that whole attention to ethical considerations. How many minutes do I have left? 2?
A couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see we could easily do a whole series on this.
Yeah.
This is really, really interesting, exciting work.
Yeah, but the last one was Airstreams that I was going to show. And the one little boy I wanted to talk about, where they're making air tunnels, he was really good, but he really struggled with literacy, writing down everything that they were doing, but he really did not want to write. And it was even December, he was still not writing much, maybe just responding with a word. And in January, he would respond only to things that had to do with science. And then finally in February, he was all pumped up about making these air tunnels. And so I sat down with him and I did an interactive writing with him, where I wrote, he has a force of air center in his classroom. And then I handed the pen back to him and he wrote, it has a ping pong ball. And then he handed the pen back to me. I wrote, it has a vacuum cleaner. So we did that until we had the whole story written. And every time we added a sentence, we would go back and reread it.
It's 4:30.
Oh, sorry. And he read the whole thing. And then he said, he went over it with brown marker, and then he asked me to make 5 copies of it because he was so proud of what he had read, and he wanted one hung up in the center. So to me, engineering and literacy, it's a no-brainer. It's this wonderful, natural way to integrate STEM and literacy. And I'm sorry, I should have timed it a little bit better.
Oh, that's okay. If can you stay for just another minute or two? If people have some questions, if you have any questions, type them in the chat, and we will try to get to a couple of your questions. If you need to leave, we understand because it is 5:30.
I just want to say, if they want to go to our website, we have a lot of free materials, experience sheets that they can download and print. And we also have what's called a STEMware marketplace, where things that you can't purchase in the store, our industrial technology department is using that as coursework for their students to source the materials and build it and create it according to our specifications. And then we can offer it to teachers at cost.
So, sort of a comment here. There is a common division between the grades in the school, and I found K through 2 is a real different area for teacher in comparison with 3 to 8. What do you think about that? Just in terms of like the difference between the sorts of activities that kids are doing and the environment in those grades.
Yes, I agree. K2 is focused almost entirely on literacy development and mathematics, and kids are denied science from preschool to 4th grade. And then so the children that excel in science but not necessarily in literacy experience failure for 4 years before they finally get back to science, and by then they're pretty beaten down.
Yeah.
And teacher prep focus mostly on the upper grades in science because they don't know what to do with the little kids. So it is difficult.
If you go in and you are interested in focusing on early elementary and pre-K and kindergarten, are you just not getting a lot of science instruction?
If you are, we're finding that our early childhood majors get a really full-bodied idea of what it is to integrate. But you, in Iowa, you can get your K-5 licensure and not take early childhood, which is unfortunate because they don't get that developmental piece of child development. So we try to get them into the Region Center as often as we can, and we're getting more and more curriculum classes that are coming down with their students to engage with these materials. And our area education agencies are starting to come as well too. Yep, I just shared the screen again at regioncenter.uni.edu.
Okay.
And they could like us on Facebook, and that will give them information of when new things are put up on the website or events that we're having. We do a lot of presentations across the country and even in other countries, and we'll post that on the website as well.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to encourage you to, if you're not familiar with linkengineering.org, to go and check it out. That's a project of the National Academy of Engineering with sponsorship from Chevron. And it's just been such a pleasure. I think that we could easily do a series of many, many episodes of this wonderful work. So many ways to connect literacy and engineering, and obviously the two support each other really well. Thank you so much, Beth Van Meeteren, for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to meet you and hear about the work that you're doing. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend and good holidays.
Thank you. Good night.